What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channel, Fantasy Football 201. In this video, we're going to be looking at a 2023 full PPR, 2 flex, 1 quarterback league, how all these guys were drafted when we were looking at them back in August, and how this season actually turned out. Looking at these draft picks and taking advantage of lessons learned when we're looking forward to the 2024 fantasy football season. I'm going to be making videos throughout the year to prep you for the 2024 fantasy football season. Been a little while since I've been on this channel. You can check out some of my previous content and stuff below, but I make a lot of different videos, not just fantasy football, but other things too. So we'll go ahead and get right started here. This is the draft right here for 2023 in one of my leagues that I had with some friends. So these are all pretty competitive players, and this is how they drafted. So we're looking at this as generally how players got drafted in 2023. There may be some exceptions, but this is generally where guys were going in these drafts. So round one, biggest disappointment from this, I would say, is Austin Ekeler. A lot of that, you could argue Justin Jefferson, but a lot of that was injury related. But Austin Ekeler is the most concerning. However, I can see a potential, depending on his situation next year with the coaching staff, that he could turn it around. Biggest riser from this draft is Tyreek Hill. He was a big sleeper if you took him at the end. In this particular draft, he went at the 108. Some places he fell a little further than that. So for context, he's probably going to be around, I would say, the 103 next year. There's a competition between him, McCaffrey, and Jefferson, I would say, for who's going to go number 1 overall next year. My quick take on that is that I believe Jefferson should be the number 1. However, pay attention to the quarterback position in Minnesota. If they don't bring back Cousins and they have a lot of the same problems that they have in the second half of the season where they're rolling out guys like Nick Mullins or Joshua Dobbs, it's going to be a little dicey, and that could hurt Jefferson's ceiling, but he's still an elite asset, and even with these other quarterbacks I mentioned, he's still played pretty well. The biggest takeaway that I want to take as lessons learned, if you look at this particular draft, Patrick Mahomes went at the 104. Now, I would say that this is much higher than he was taken in a majority of drafts, but I think this brings up an interesting point that I want to bring up, is that in fantasy football, a lot of guys want to take these big quarterbacks because big name quarterbacks, I should say, because they give you a lot of points. And Patrick Mahomes, going into this, was the number 1 overall rated quarterback. He finished at what I believe is the quarterback 8. I'm going to double check this real quick. But Patrick Mahomes, very disappointing for that position. So if you took him around that range, you would have been extremely disappointed with his outcome in how he actually performed, and finished as a quarterback 7. So not too far off. But again, you're passing up on guys like Chase, Tyreek Hill to draft a quarterback where not only did Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts significantly outperform Mahomes, they were both the number 1 and 2 quarterbacks respectively, but you really are costing yourself some of these premium assets on the flex that are better for you. So I never feel comfortable drafting quarterback number 1, or excuse me, with the first round pick. And I think this is a good example of how if you took Mahomes in the first round this year, you would have really regretted it. Travis Kelce, kind of the same situation there. And I think that next year it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the tight ends, because I could see tight ends not going in the first round. I could also see some reach for, but Travis Kelce showed this season he's not rated at the same value as he's been in years past. Those are most of the highlights I want to bring up here. I'm going to go a little quicker through these other rounds as we go through, but round 2, you see you got Barkley all the way through Amon-Ra St. Brown on this picture here. So the biggest takeaway that I want to say is that the receivers that you get at the end of the draft were the biggest sleepers. CeeDee Lamb was the biggest sleeper in this round. He's going to be a first-round pick next year, as well as Amon-Ra St. Brown, who I believe is also going to be a first-round pick next year. And I think this highlights, when you're in PPR fantasy football leagues, it is more valuable to have an elite wide receiver than some of these running backs, because this particular season, the running back performance relative to the expectation that they were drafted was all over the place. As illustrated by Raheem Mostert, who I'm going to talk about later, was the number 3 overall running back. Other guys like Kyron Williams was the number 5 overall running back, and he was not even on the board. So All that being said, some of these wide receivers that you can get, especially when you get the extra points for receptions as the league is trending towards more passing, it's invaluable to have a guy like that. And in this particular draft, you look at all these guys that were taken in the second round. Saquon Barkley, up and down, but relatively disappointing to his output. You also have Nick Chubb injured. Not much you can do about that. Josh Jacobs was decent, but he was still disappointing considering his performance. Tony Pollard, disappointing season. Derrick Henry actually finished pretty well relative to other running backs as a running back 10, but not a great season. And Ramondre Stevenson, extremely disappointing. So some of these other receivers you get in the back end, like Lamb and Brown, I would argue would be better picks than all of the running backs taken in this second round. The biggest disappointment that I want to bring up is Ramondre Stevenson. He was taken at the 207, and I think this brings up a good point, is that we fall into traps in the offseason of, oh, this running back is going to get a lot of volume. But there were concerns about the New England offense and their ability to perform as well as they have in years past. And if you took Stevenson that high, it would have been extremely disappointing of an output. He performed very poorly relative to his draft position. Next, we're going to take a look at the third round. And this one is going Najee Harris all the way over to DK Metcalf, as you can see on the screen in this video. The biggest takeaway that I want to say here is that the two running backs were the biggest sleepers, Travis Etienne and Jahmyr Gibbs, taken at 307 and 308. Travis Etienne finished as the running back 2 on the season, and Jahmyr Gibbs finished as the running back 8 on the season. And you look at all those running backs taken ahead of them in the earlier rounds. And as I was mentioning with Ramondre Stevenson, we make the mistake in the offseason of undervaluing guys that are extremely explosive and extremely talented because of the fact that they might share the running back workload. But I think a reality that's coming to fruition in the NFL as it's progressing with a more pass-heavy offense is that most running backs are in some form of a timeshare. There's not a straight 95% snap workload that running backs are getting nowadays. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, a lot of these backfields are splitting with each other. And if you have guys that are explosive and on an explosive offense, even if they're not certain to get all the touches in the backfield, it's generally better than not to go with the explosive guys over guys that are supposed to get a lot of volume but have question marks. In this case, Travis Etienne, a lot of questions about Tank Bigsby, who was a running back that we really had never even heard of and was coming into his rookie season. But he really did not perform up to expectations and did not do as well. So a lot of people fell out of favor with Etienne because of Bigsby as a potential handcuff to take snaps away. But Etienne is very explosive, and missing out on him for some of these names, if you took Stevenson when you had the opportunity to take Etienne, definitely would have regretted that. Other takeaways I want to make here is that you got some pretty good quarterback value in this round with Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson. This is an appropriate place to take quarterbacks if they give you rushing value. I generally don't like taking guys like Joe Burrow, for example, in the third round because he really doesn't give you anything on the ground aside from QB sneaks that result in touchdowns, which are not generally going to happen with him. So another takeaway from round 3 in terms of guys that were disappointing, Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins are the ones that I would say are disappointing. And a lesson learned from this situation is that we fall into the trap in the offseason of going for the guys that are projected as number 2 wide receiver in an elite offense. But oftentimes, don't underestimate the value that somebody has as a clear-cut number 1 in their offense that are taken later in drafts and perform better. A good example of this is Keenan Allen. So Keenan Allen had some question marks. He was taken in round 4. I'll get to him in a sec. But before his injury, he was the wide receiver 2. And he's still the wide receiver 6 on the season despite missing the past 3 games. So that's very good value in the 4th round. Performed way better than Waddle and Higgins. And then other guys, Mike Evans taken in the 6th round here. He was the wide receiver 7 on the season. So both of these guys are clear-cut number 1s. We had questions because of their age, but they still ended up providing more value because of the role they had compared to guys like Higgins and Waddle. And Higgins, I know, was hurt, so Waddle Also, both of them dealt with injuries, but when they were healthy, they still did not have the level of volume that you would get from guys like Evans and Allen getting clear number one targets on their team. We now go to the fourth round, starting off with Breece Hall and going all the way over to Dameon Pierce. So I'll start with Breece Hall. This was the biggest sleeper on this board, and it's kind of scary to think what could have been if Aaron Rodgers had stayed healthy, because the line was terrible, and there were questions about Breece Hall because of his injury, so it's understandable why he went in this round. But he's probably going to be a first-round running back next year, and assuming this team is going to get its line together, it's going to get some better quarterback play as well with Aaron Rodgers coming back, he could be excellent in 2024. So you're not going to see him in this round moving forward, but this was the best sleeper here. You also had some pretty good picks here that kind of had up and down seasons. Amari Cooper, Justin Fields, Deebo Samuel, Kenneth Walker. You can kind of expect that from guys that go around this range, that there's going to be up and down performances. The biggest disappointment by far is Miles Sanders. And this kind of talks about what I was getting at earlier with Ramondre Stevenson, is that we take these guys like Sanders because we think they're going to have the clear-cut number one role on this team. He's had success in the past with Philadelphia. But oftentimes, if running backs aren't extended and they're moving on to another team, that kind of is a reflection of how that team views that player. And Miles Sanders, I think we didn't take that into consideration with the Philadelphia Eagles recognizing that this guy's lost a step. He's not where he was before. And Miles Sanders got beat out in the season by Chuba Hubbard. So Miles Sanders overall on this season, we'll take a look at his numbers. He finished as the running back 51. And over the last few weeks in PPR, he's had 4.2, 1.8, 3.3, 7.4, 3.9. Just very poor performances. So this was definitely a dud here in the fourth round. And as I said earlier, the guys like Keenan Allen, clear-cut number one wide receivers that are available here, don't underestimate that. Even Allen next year he's getting a year older. We'll see how things go with how he's looking in the offseason and what kind of weapons they add on that team. But that's a key takeaway for me, is that guys that are the number one on a good team, you got to take advantage of that situation over running backs that are, they could get a lot of volume, but they're on a bad team and could get games scripted out quite often. Other disappointments here include Dameon Pierce. I don't think anybody really expected how the Texans would do this season with C.J. Stroud, but I think Dameon Pierce was one of the more disappointing aspects of that, getting beat out by Devin Singletary. Kind of brings into question what his role is going to be moving forward in NFL as a fantasy asset at all. But again, this is a situation where instead of Pierce, he might have been better off taking a guy like DJ Moore, who went 3 picks later, that I'm going to talk about next. And the fifth round, Alexander Mattison all the way over to Trevor Lawrence were the fifth round picks, as you can see on the screen. Big takeaways here. As I mentioned earlier, DJ Moore, number one wide receiver on his offense, and performed extremely well this season, especially when Justin Fields was there. So number 8 wide receiver on the year, even with all those games with Tyson Bagent. So again, look for guys that are going to be number one on their team in targets. That's a big takeaway in these middle rounds. If you can find guys like that, those are great pickups that you can get. Other players to talk about, Alvin Kamara is an interesting player to bring up here because he scared a lot of people away because he had a 3-game suspension. But I think that a big takeaway here is that Alvin Kamara is extremely explosive and has a good role as both the pass-catching running back and the volume on his team. So we knew he was going to have a good season, but we're scared away by those 3 games. And I think that a big takeaway is that you look at all the injuries these running backs have, and what really is 3 games that you missed at the beginning of the season. Because if you can plug and play different guys off of waivers this season, and what you would if you had done Raheem Mostert, Kyron Williams, you would have been fine. Just stream for 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks with these suspended guys. If you see these guys that are extremely explosive that drop in drafts, make sure you queue them and you get them on your team. even if you had to reach for him in the 4th or the 3rd round, even Alvin Kamara would have been great value for you. Gonna double check how he performed on the season, but he performed a lot better than these running backs taken ahead of him. Number 9 on the season, even though he missed 3 games to start the season. That's incredible value that you can get there in the middle of the draft. Other guys of note here, some disappointing players. J.K. Dobbins, injury. It's just an unfortunate situation for him. Dallas Goedert as a tight end was pretty disappointing considering where he was taken. And Trevor Lawrence as a quarterback. So this is kind of that range where you get these quarterbacks. I personally do not take quarterbacks high in these first 5 rounds unless I'm getting a guy who also has rushing capabilities. A big sleeper that I'm going to be targeting next year is Anthony Richardson for that reason. But guys like Trevor Lawrence, who are anointed as being these great quarterbacks but don't really provide a lot of rushing ability, present some risk for you because they generally are producing the same numbers as guys that are not getting drafted. So again, if you can get a quarterback in these later rounds, you can get similar performance to Trevor Lawrence. And hence, his performance on the season was not great. He was the quarterback 14, but in this draft was taken as the 5th or 6th quarterback off the board. Just pretty rough performance from him. So don't reach for these quarterbacks in these middle rounds. You get tempted by these other guys that are drafting with you, but take that into consideration for future drafts to not reach for quarterbacks that do not provide much on the ground. 6th round, you've got Terry McLaurin all the way through Kyle Pitts. So this is where you start to get into more of the point in the draft where it's kind of a crapshoot. But again, the guys that stood out here that did well are the ones that were number 1 receivers on their offense that slipped. Michael Pittman did very well this season. He's missed some games recently because of a concussion, but he's been the wide receiver 13 on the season. That's better than some of these guys like Waddle and Higgins that were taken higher, even Calvin Ridley. So again, these are some sleepers that you can really pay attention to. He fell because of the concern of the quarterback, but you can't take away the value of somebody that is the number 1 look on that team. Other guys that did well here, Mike Evans, I think, was the biggest sleeper among this group. Finished as the number 7 wide receiver on the season. Let me double check that again. Yep, number 7. So did extremely well for you if you took him here. You also got some pretty good value here in Dak Prescott, although generally Dak Prescott finished as the QB4 on the season, or finished as in we're at week 17, week 18. I'm not counting that. But I'd be a little high for him here, but he did give you some pretty good value. Other guys that gave you some pretty good value here are David Njoku, late season sleeper at tight end. Some poor performances here. Terry McLaurin, based on the Washington quarterback situation, did not do great. Cam Akers got phased out. I think that was probably the biggest disappointment from this round. Kyle Pitts as well. I have no interest in Kyle Pitts until they can either get him on a different team or get a different coach, because we're just going to keep seeing the same thing every year where he gets overdrafted and is going to lure people into this hype that he's going to suddenly break out. But it's been 3 seasons now of pretty mediocre play. That's just not worth it for his ADP. That pretty much applies to most of the Falcons except for Bijan Robinson. 7th round here. So we got a couple running backs going early. Isaiah Pacheco, Javonte Williams, Rachaad White, all the way across the board to, Marquise Brown. So some of these running backs that you took early were gave you some pretty good value. The biggest one is Rachaad White. So Rachaad White fell because we didn't know what his role was going to be with Baker Mayfield. Same reason that Mike Evans fell for that same reason, as we didn't know how Baker Mayfield would do. And Rachaad White didn't really have a lot of opportunity last year. So how is he going to do stepping into the number 1 role? So he fell on a lot of boards. But then again, this is something where if you pay attention to the reports and you see that he's going to have a lot of volume, if you could take the bet that this is going to be a good team and he's going to have the opportunity to make the pick worth it, it's great value. And Rachaad White did excellent this season. Top 5 running back, I believe. He was just outside the top 5. He was number 6. So did great this season for you in PPR formats. And there's a difference between taking guys here in the 7th round versus Ramondre Stevenson. You know, you had questions about Stevenson and if the Patriots would be a good team that were similar to the Bucs at the time in August. But if you're taking a running back in the 7th round here, this is great value. Whereas reaching for somebody like that in the early first 3 rounds is very risky. And if you took the strategy of getting a discount with Rachaad White, you definitely made out ahead on that deal. Other guys, Dalvin Cook, very poor. David Montgomery was another sleeper here. That was a top 5 running back in the early half of the season before he got injured. James Cook also did very well. You got some receivers here who have been up and down. George Pickens has come on strong of late, but some disappointments here of note are Christian Watson and Marquise Brown. And I think a lot of that, Watson due to injury, but Brown due to role in the offense. So the takeaway here is that this is where you start to get into a little more murky of an area, but some of these running backs that you took here are very good value. And I think that gets back at the strategy that I was talking about earlier, is that in today's fantasy football, traditional strategy was always, you got to get running backs as soon as possible, we'll get the running backs. But some of these running backs that you can get late are very good sleeper values. And you had a lot of them here in the 7th round that were very good. So next year, my advice would be to get an elite pass catcher and then try to get some running backs late, because you can get some good ones here that were not available, that are more available surprisingly among running backs than receivers, because at this point you're starting to get into a little more murkiness with these receivers and what their number 1 role is going to be. 8th round, I almost said Deontay Johnson all the way over to Kirk Cousins. So this is the point. You see San Francisco 49ers defense taking at the number 803. And this illustrates the point that this is just way too high to take a defense. San Francisco's defense, although they have a lot of excellent players, they finished as the number 11 overall defense. This is very disappointing value for where you took them in the draft. I personally do not take a defense until the last round or 2. And especially when you have these defenses like the 49ers that are going up the board early, it's just not worth taking them considering some of these flex positions that you're mixing out on. Other guys that were taken later, Jahan Dotson had some good games. He's going to be interesting to look at next year in terms of what they do at quarterback. Jackson Smith, the Jigba, and Jordan Addison were kind of the same way. So this is where some of these rookies that will probably go next year will be, like Rome Odunze, Malik Neighbors, some of these first, 2nd round wide receivers that are there because we haven't seen them before, but could be good sleeper value. And, some quarterbacks here. This is, I think, an appropriate range to start taking quarterbacks like Tua and Kirk Cousins. They're both very good baseline quarterbacks that generally don't have a lot of bad games, but don't have a lot of high ceiling games. If you're looking for a guy that is not going to run the ball a lot, but going to give you a decent floor, this is a good place to start looking in the 8th round. 9th round. So this is the Dallas Cowboys defense all the way over to Quentin Johnson. Quentin Johnson was a bust. I think that's all I really have to say about that. Another point I want to take across here is that Daniel Carlson was the first kicker taken off the board. And this is actually very atypical because it's usually Justin Tucker. But a point, and this is if you want to, I'm going to leave this video at the end, and that video is specific to the 2021 season, but it illustrates all the reasons why you do not draft a kicker high in this fantasy football redraft format at all. You want to wait until the end. In fact, in sleeper leagues, I don't even draft a kicker because they don't force you to draft one. I just wait and stream ones because the number 1 kicker this season was Brandon Aubrey, who was universally undrafted because he didn't even have a spot on the team at the time. Daniel Carlson, who was the first kicker taken here, was the number 24 performing kicker on the season. The point is that you never know what you're going to get with these guys, And I personally would rather keep the kicker spot to preserve an additional flex until you get to game day, because if it's more valuable to have a backup running back in case somebody gets injured than it is to have somebody who you could generally get a dime a dozen of these kickers off the board that can score anywhere from 10 points to 4 points to some may go off that you never expect for 15 or more points. So it's never worth taking these kickers any higher than the last round. And this was just such a wasted pick for whoever took that individual there. Other running backs, I think Brian Robinson would be a good sleeper to talk about here as a running back that has a questionable role, but there's no clear number one, is a pretty good value to take a flyer on here in the 9th round. And then another takeaway here that I want to start talking about is age of receivers and opportunity. So you got Juju Smith-Schuster at 907 and Zay Flowers at 908 right next to each other. And Zay Flowers would be an easily better option. Juju has not shown anything over the past few seasons and has been on the decline when he was with the Chiefs. So going into this season, there was some hype about, oh, he could be the number one on the Patriots now. But Zay Flowers is a rookie who also could be a number one on the Ravens. And Zay Flowers was not anything necessarily special. He was pretty inconsistent. But he was by far a better pick than Juju Smith-Schuster just solely because of the opportunity and the ceiling that you could get. Juju was such a disappointment this season. He's really never going to be drafted again, I imagine, in fantasy football. So this is the point in the draft where if you're drafting these guys like Juju Smith-Schuster, like Gabe Davis, who went in the 10th round, like Rashad Bateman, it's just better to take players that are younger, that have more of a ceiling than guys that you've seen for a couple of seasons and you really don't feel strong about the return. So important lesson to take away there. Pick up the guys that are going to be younger players that could step into a lot of opportunity. 10th round, and then we'll kind of do a quick summary from there. So we got Dalton Schultz all the way down to Evan McPherson. So this is a range where you're starting to look at some of these kickers are starting to get drafted. You've got some other back-end receivers. And again, some of the guys that were disappointing were Kadarius Toney, Gabe Davis. Cortland Sutton had a good season, and I think that this brings up a point that he had the potential to step into a number one with the Broncos. Jerry Jeudy generally went higher, but Cortland Sutton provided pretty good value here in the 10th round. It would have been a great pickup here. So other guys that did pretty well this season relative to their draft position in the 10th round were Cole Kmet had some decent games. Dalton Schultz actually did pretty well considering where he was drafted. So those were some good flyers to take it well that hit at certain points of the season. And generally at this point in the draft, as I said, in these later rounds, stash up players that are going to be young guys that can step up. If they don't show anything for the first few weeks, then you can move on with some other options. But look at guys that are going to be the number one on their team potentially. Don't stash like third or fourth string receivers like Quentin Johnson who didn't do anything. Look at guys based on the opportunity of who's ahead of them on the depth chart. Can they step up into that position? Because that leaves some guys that were not drafted that had pretty good seasons like Puka Nacua. We really didn't have any other options aside from Cooper Kupp on that team. He did very well this season. Adam Thielen kind of tailed off, but he did very well at the beginning of the season because he was the clear number one on a team that was hurting for other receivers stepping up. So guys like that, pay attention to that situation because they could be some great value for you late in the draft. Other guys that I want to bring up here as well. Raheem Mostert picked up in the 12th round. And this brings up the point that I've said about running backs is that you can get some sleepers here. Miami running backs went pretty low because we didn't know who was going to be taken when. You got Devon Achane in the 11th round, and you've got Raheem Mostert in the 12th round. Both of them were excellent this season. Relative to the amount of games that they played, Achane was injured a lot. But don't sleep on some of these late running backs here. So that's all that I got for this video today. We're going to be looking at some more fantasy football recaps of the 2023 season. We're going to be going in the order of the draft. Some teams that are going to be projected to draft higher that did not perform as well this season because some of the teams later on are still playing and there's a little more to be determined. But we'll take a look at that over the next few weeks and start to prep for the 2024 fantasy football season. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested, subscribe for more content. Check out the description for more types of videos that I make as well. Hope you have a good one, and Happy New Year.